All right, welcome back to another very special episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, and today we are joined and blessed, should I say, with the Honorable Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, who was under the United States Secretary of Department as Assistant Secretary, and that and so much more. Dr. Roberts, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Dr. J.
It's always a pleasure speaking to someone, especially someone who has the same views as I do. And it's important that someone from the Reagan generation, speak to the people that are in this current generation that are just now being able to vote things that they don't remember. I fully remember Reagan. I mean, I wasn't old enough to vote for him, but I was born before he was even, right when he was running for president, let alone when he ran in, and won in the landslide. So this is very, very important. Now, how did you get involved? Become? How did you become involved with the Treasury Department and confirmed with by the Senate?
Well, I had an academic appointment at Stanford University, and an economist, and I had a chance to go into the congressional staff as economic counsel to Representative Jack Kemp. And I decided to do that because I wanted to see if there was any correlation between how professors teach economic policy works and how it actually works in Washington.
Yeah.
So I decided to find out if we knew what we were talking about, and went and took this job with Kemp, and he was a bright guy, a new congressman, but he had been a famous pro football quarterback and had taken his team, I think, to the Super Bowl several times, and he wanted to do something in economic policy that would deal with the stagflation in the economy, the rising inflation, the rising unemployment, the difficulty of fighting one without worsening the other, and so forth. And so I came up with what later was known as the Kemp-Roth tax reduction bill, which was to change the balance between supply and demand, to get supply growing more and demand less, so that you would minimize inflation and maximize output. So we worked on that. I went on from Kemp to be the chief economist for the House Budget Committee. The Republicans on the Budget Committee adopted this policy. I went into the Senate staff, and oddly enough, had more luck with the Democrats in the Senate adopting the policy. And from there, I went up to the Wall Street Journal. I was associate editor, and further explained and developed the policy. So when Reagan won the election, he called me to Washington to take over, to be in charge of the United States domestic economic policy, and appointed me Assistant Secretary of Treasury. So my job was to get his economic program out of his administration so Congress could vote on it. So that's how I got mixed up in it, and I didn't know any of that was going to happen. When I decided to go to Washington, I didn't go there for that purpose. But the way things developed, and I was there, and I understood what had to be done, and was able to convince people. And so this is how I ended up there.
My undergrad study was in economics. Were you surprised by the difference in what you were taught and learned from the academia versus what was going on at the Hill?
Well, I was already suspicious, which is why I wanted to go to, to either get rid of the suspicions or confirm them. Um, so I don't quite know how to answer that. But what supply side economics did was to correct a failure in the Keynesian demand management analysis that had been taught since World War II. The Keynesians had overlooked the supply side effects of some kinds of fiscal policy, and not being aware of that, the way their policy was implemented uh, caused the stagflation, and they had no answer to it. They didn't know how to cure it, uh, and so I just happened to hit on that cure. Now, I didn't do it with all by myself. There were other people thinking along these lines, and Norman Ture was one, Art Laffer, Robert Mundell, who won the Nobel Prize, a University of Chicago professor. Um, my predecessor at the Wall Street Journal, Jude Wininski. All of these people had the idea that there was something lacking in the Keynesian approach that caused price to rise faster than output, and that's where stagflation came from. And so, uh, uh, there were a handful, a big handful of people thinking about this. I just happened to be in the policy position where I could implement it. Uh,
Can
it's not like I am the only one who thought about it.
can you describe for the people, especially those who are abroad, the difference between stagnation versus inflation?
Well, stagflation is both. Stagflation is when you are experiencing a rise a rise in inflation without any real growth in employment,
And we
or,
we
or
have a
when you
huge inflation standard. I mean, in general, if you look at the prices now, 2019, say, versus 35 years ago, the cost of a home, the price of gasoline, all these factors that are used in GDP, or not GDP, when they, I guess, would be the indicators of inflation, are way, way higher than I anticipated.
there's no doubt about it. I think the current dollar is worth about 2 cents compared to what it was worth a number of years ago. So I don't know what you're asking now. Over time, the United States had a long period in its history in which prices were stable. It is best as economic historians can tell from whatever data exists and so on. There was a long period, many decades, in which the price level was stable. A lot of the inflation seemed to have started with the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. It seems to have been a major post-World War II phenomenon. And it goes hand in hand with Keynesian demand management, because Keynesian demand management also is a post-World War II phenomenon. And it seems to have come from applying, by pumping up aggregate consumer demand with money creation, credit creation, to put the pressure of demand on the economy. They were trying to encourage production, output. And so they had this, they used to say the reason the factories produce is that people buy. And so the idea was, if we can get a lot of money in the hands of the people, a lot of credit, debt, where they can go in debt, however, but if they're spending, then the companies are going to respond to the spending by making more goods. And this is essentially the way the Keynesians thought. Now, what tended to happen, and maybe that would have worked had there not been any income tax, but there was an income tax, and it rose, and it got higher and higher rates. And the rates got so high where it didn't really pay to increase output, just let the price go up. And so the firms sort of stopped investing at the same rate. And so the pressure of spending on the economy was not causing the production to rise because the disincentives were so great. For example, the tax on investment income was 70%. The top rate was 70%. So that means if you earned $10, you gave $7 to the government and kept $3. Well, this didn't encourage much risk taking or anything. The top corporate rate, I think, what was it? I've forgotten now, 50%. Or 42%, something like that. The top rate on individual income, wages and salaries was 50%. So, if you were a doctor and you worked all week, and they're taking half your income, you just started knocking off Friday at lunch and went to the golf course. So the effect of the taxes being as high as they were was curtailing the response of supply to the pressure that they were putting on demand, and therefore the prices were going up more than the output. And this is where the stagflation came from. This is what the supply side economists figured out. And they figured out, okay, how do you solve it? Well, you reduce the tax rates at the margin where people make decisions. Do I work more or take more leisure? Do I save and invest, or do I engage in more current consumption? And to get the output up, you want them to work more and to save and invest more. But they were doing the opposite. And that's why we lowered the tax rates. And it worked. No one's seen stagflation since. We've not had the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve has disappeared. The Federal Reserve has been trying to bring the Phillips curve back for a decade by printing money. They have this target. They want to have 2% inflation, because they say if you don't have 2% inflation, the economy doesn't grow. Well, that's nonsense.
Yeah, I was just going to say that doesn't make sense.
No, but they believe it. That's what counts. And so, the Reagan policy did work, and that's my explanation. That's how it came about.
Now, even nowadays, Reaganomics is considered one of the best economic revivals of not just this generation, or even the past generation. I think since World War II. What's your say about that?
Well, supply side economics that we implemented worked because the tax rates were so high. If the rates are low, it doesn't have much effect, because if the rates are low, the disincentives aren't there. But if the rates are high, if the government is taking away, the majority of any gain in your income, you've got less incentive to produce more. So it works, the supply side economics, but it won't work when the tax rates are low. If tax rates are really low, then the supply response you get from cutting them lower is weak. But if the tax rates are high and you cut them, the response is strong. So it really depends. It's not an elixir that solves any kind of economic problem. It was targeted to the specific problem that Jimmy Carter had faced and couldn't answer, and that Reagan inherited and had to deal with. And it was targeted to deal with the economy in which inflation was rising more rapidly than output. That is, prices were going up instead of the production of real goods and services. And so it was cutting into employment gains because if you're not producing more, then the jobs, you don't have the same job growth, you not have the same employment. And so that's how it worked for Reagan, and it worked because the rates were high and they were serving as disincentives to an increase in output. It was nothing to do about giving people more money to spend. See, the way the Keynesians think about a tax cut is it puts more demand pressure on the economy. Oh, we'll give the people more money to spend by reducing their taxes, so they'll spend more, and therefore the factories will produce more. But not when the tax rates are so high. They don't produce more. And so the prices go up. And that was the situation we were in. That's what they mean by stagflation. Prices rise relative to output. And this is a very dangerous situation. And it was Reagan who had the understanding that he could see the supply side had a solution. No one else had a solution, which is another reason we got to do it. If there had been competing solutions, I don't know that we would have gotten ours in. It would have depended on the PR campaign, how the newspapers came down, and how the economics profession and all the rest. But as we didn't have any rival, because no one else knew what to do, they said, "Okay, it's the only hope we have. Let's let them do it." And so that's how it transpired.
I'm sure you might be familiar with the name Ed Rollins, right? He was a campaign advisor for Reagan. He's also now one of the people who is advocating for Trump's re-election in 2020. Do you know Ed Rollins?
I know who he is, but you have to understand, I was a policy person, and these are political operatives. They're either fundraisers or they advise on campaign tactics in this state, this city, this locality. That's a totally different line of work than the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in charge of domestic United States economic policy. My work isn't political. It has to do with managing an economy so that it functions successfully. They are trying to make a political campaign function successfully. And these are different things. So we don't have any real interaction. I know who they are, but I can't say that I know them personally or hang out with them or talk to them. I just don't. It's a different world.
You're absolutely right. Like I said, he was the campaign advisor, which you knew of, and you were involved in policy, which is making things as opposed to the business of making things happen. Like as you said, the delegates and the states and the cities and each of those that count. But one of the reasons I brought him up is because a lot of people, especially on One American News, even on Fox News and whatever you read that's conservative, compare Trump as this generation as close to of a president as Ronald Reagan. I don't know if anyone can ever compete with that because Ronald Reagan, everybody loved Ronnie. That's a line taken even from the left. They did. They absolutely did. I mean, he won in a truly landslide in a victory. But what's your take on Trump in general and specifically on the economic wars he's having, say, with the tariffs with China, particularly China, actually?
Well, I don't think there's any similarity in the kind of people or character or nature of Reagan and Trump. There is a similarity in that Reagan had two goals. One was to cure stagflation, that was to fix the economy. And the other was to end the Cold War because he realized the tensions with the Soviet Union were dangerous because they could result in nuclear war, specifically because of false warnings. Many people don't know this, but the warning systems about incoming ICBMs, they produce a plethora of false alarms. And the reason no one ever pushed the button was that the American presidents had been working with the Soviet leaders to minimize tensions. We had arms control agreements originating with Richard Nixon. He got arms control agreements. These went on through the years, Carter. And when Reagan got there, he said, this is too dangerous to be having these tensions. We've got to end the Cold War. So he had those two goals, and he achieved both of them. Now, Trump is like that, too. What attracted me to him was he said, he was the only one who said, we've got to normalize relations with Russia. We can't have these tensions. It's good for everybody that we normalize relations. And he said, we've got to bring the jobs home. We've got to get the jobs back for Americans. So he addressed the two important issues of his time. No other candidate did. And so in this sense, he's like Reagan. He understood the two most important things. Now, unlike Reagan, he hasn't been successful because the military security complex said, we're not going to have you normalize relations with Russia because we've got a 1,000 billion dollar annual budget that depends on them being the enemy.
A trillion, basically, right? 1,000 billion.
And so they came up with Russiagate to stop him from normalizing relations with Russia. They didn't even want him to speak to Putin. And his approach to solving the jobs offshoring policy was tariffs. This was wrong. This was the wrong policy. He didn't have an advisor who understood what they needed to do to bring the jobs home. And he thought somehow that these imports from China were Chinese goods. Some of them are, but they're mainly Apple computers, Apple iPhones, Nike shoes, Levi Strauss jeans. It's the offshored production of all the American global companies who went to China to take advantage of the cheap labor.
Google too, from what I hear. And like you said, Apple, very high-end products produced in a company where it's, a communist by nature, and I'm sure the production of, say, an iPhone there is dirt cheap compared to what it retails for in America. I can't even imagine the profits that they have. I mean, that's why they say they're their first trillion-dollar company because of that, because of their high-end products.
They didn't cut the price. They just cut their labor cost.
That's right.
And you see, in the long run, this is a self-defeating policy because when you abandon your domestic workforce, you abandon the manufacturing workers in America, you're shrinking the middle class, and therefore you're shrinking consumer incomes and aggregate demand for your products. So they're maximizing their profits in the short run, but they're eliminating the income potential of the domestic Americans to buy the products. Because when a manufacturing job moves out, the guy's not making $25 an hour anymore. He's making $10 an hour stocking shelves in Home Depot or Walmart. And so his disposable income, his discretionary income shrinks. And so all of this offshoring is really destroying the domestic American market for the computers and the iPhones and the Nike shoes and the Levi jeans and everything else. But they don't think that far. The CEOs are there for 5 or 6 years. The boards are there for short times. They're thinking right now how to maximize their income. And if profits go up, so do their bonuses and their stock options and everything else. So what they do, in effect, they sell out the company's long-term prospects in America in order to maximize its profits in the short term, because that maximizes their income. They're not going to be there in the long term.
What
So this is what is undercut the economy. It's why there's so many homeless. It's why a lot of these homeless have jobs. They just don't make enough money to pay rent. All these homeless people are not just drug addicts or worthless people. A lot of them have jobs. A lot of them work, and they live on the streets because they don't get paid enough to pay the apartment rent, especially in high-income areas. This is well known, well documented. We also know that there are more people aged 24 to 34, more Americans, 24 to 34, who live at home with parents or grandparents than who live independently.
Yes.
And that's because they can't get an income large enough to give them an independent existence. So this is all the external cost of the corporations moving their jobs offshore. See, I follow the payroll job statistics every month. It's been years and years since there have been any manufacturing or industrial jobs created. Most of the jobs are lowly paid domestic services, and they're increasingly part-time. So, you have people who work 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to get enough money to break even. So this is not the kind of economy that existed in the United States prior to the offshoring era. You see, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it convinced China and India that socialism didn't work, and that it was a way to decline, but capitalism produced riches. And so both of these massive countries, the 2 countries with the largest populations in the world, they opened their labor markets to foreign capital.
India and China, right?
India and China. And that's when the movement of manufacturing to China began, and the movement of IT, information technology, software engineering started moving to India. And so this just kind of drained out a large percentage of the American middle class, and therefore it has made income growth in the United States very difficult. In fact, it doesn't happen. There really hasn't been any real increase in median family real income for decades.
55,000 companies, manufacturing companies, is what was said by Donald J. Trump when he was just the candidate that left the U.S. And that's not including the actual people, the number of employees for each of these companies. And you mentioned a few of them right there. Apple, one of them was, I think, air conditioning a company that Trump actually called the CEO for. But again, you're absolutely right when you gave the figure of the number of people, the percentage of those who have post high school degrees, even beyond bachelor's at this point, in the ages of 25 to 34, even higher, are forced to live at home. And like you said, they are absolutely and sadly having to work more than one job, and they cannot make ends meet. And another thing you also said, outsourcing our jobs. I'm sure, just like I feel every time you get a customer service representative, and it's somebody from India or Pakistan or something like that, or Philippines, you're wondering what the hell happened to this country? What's going on?
Well, that's what's going on. Um, the American companies can increase their profits and their bonuses by hiring foreign labor and not hiring American labor. And it works only in the short run because the effect in the intermediate and long run is to dispossess the American population of the income that gave them their high living standards. And if they don't have that income, then the market for the goods and services that the American firms are producing abroad no longer exists in the United States because people's jobs don't provide them with the money to buy the products. So in the end, it just turns the country into a third world country in which jobs consist of lowly paid domestic service jobs like waiters, waitresses, bartenders, hospital orderlies, retail clerks, bus drivers. That's the kind of workforce that the United States is developing. It no longer consists of highly skilled workers. So it's the high skills that are productive, that produce high value added, that justifies the high wages. So when you eliminate those kinds of jobs, you've eliminated the ladders of upward mobility that allowed poor people to rise. And so you end up with a stagnant and polarized economy. We see it already in the distribution of income and wealth. It's in fewer and fewer hands at the top. You know, 3 or 4 people own as much as half the population. So this is the nature of an undeveloped country. The United States is starting to look like India looked 60, 70 years ago. So this is the effect of moving high value added, high productivity jobs offshore. And then the question is, how do you get them back? It's very difficult. I have addressed how you can get them back, and what you basically have to do is change the way you tax the corporations. You tax them according to where, the geographical location, that they add value to their product. In other words, if they produce domestically, you give them a low tax rate. If they produce offshore, you give them a high tax rate. And you can offset the labor cost advantage by the tax rate. Now, that's what Trump needs to do. The tariffs don't solve the problem. The tariffs fall on the American-made goods offshore, and they are paid for by the American consumer. So to the American consumer, it's just a rise in price. It's like inflation. And they already don't have any money. So the tariffs don't hurt the Chinese. They hurt the American firms who are producing offshore, and they hurt the Americans who pay the prices, the higher prices because of the tariffs when they buy the products. Now, this finally dawned on Trump because I've been writing about it. Maybe he read something. Maybe somebody told him. And I saw the other day, if the report is true, that he has exempted Apple, Nike, and Levi and the others from paying the tariffs. So, in other words, he's had to abandon that policy, even though he continues to talk about it. So that's the only thing that he can really do. He needs to work with the corporations on bringing them back. So he'll have to change He'll have to get Congress to agree to change the way they're taxed. But also another problem they have, where do they come back to? The factories are closed up. They're in disrepair. Some of them have been turned into apartments. Others are just ruined. The supply chains are gone. The workforce may be gone. It's been 20, 25 years. People have gotten old. They've died. New entrants haven't come in to learn the skills and the discipline. It's now an economic development problem for the United States. In many ways, it's like an undeveloped country now. When you lose manufacturing and industry, and they're gone for 20 years, how do you get back? You got to start. You're starting all over. The factories aren't sitting there ready to be geared up, and the workforce isn't there, and all the supply chains aren't there. They've all went out of business when the work was moved offshore. All that has to be recreated. He can't just order them home. What are they going to come home to? If the minute they have to leave China, how are they going to produce? They won't have any sales, nothing to sell, no revenues. They'll all fail. It's a very serious problem. It requires a lot of careful thought, a lot of cooperation, no conflict. So, see, the Americans have ceased to think, and I've been noticing this for decades now. They just give orders. They tell a country, do what we say or we'll bomb you into the Stone Age. Well, that's not diplomacy. I lived through the Cold War with Russia. We never, ever insulted them. The way they talked to Putin and about Putin and the accusations and all the false charges, this never happened. Nobody would have dared say something like that to Khrushchev or Brezhnev or Joseph Stalin. It's almost insanity now, the way we just speak so harshly and demanding on everybody and tell constant demonization and lies. This is a way to have nothing but conflict. You can't resolve things that way. And yet this goes all the way back to Clinton. This started with the Bill Clinton regime. It got worse with George W. Bush. It got worse with Obama. And Trump is now doing it. All these false accusations against everybody. And now the media does it to Trump. Russiagate. There's a hoax.
God, yes. The media destroys Trump in every chance they can.
Well, they destroy. Everything is like this. It's not just them to Trump. It's Trump to Russia, Trump to China. They destroying. They're blaming white people because some nutcase in El Paso shot some immigrants. So now all white people are said to be white supremacists, racist. They want to kill the Hispanics. Everybody talks like this. It's all conflict, conflict, conflict. Well, when you got Russia and China, the kinds of military capabilities they have, the nuclear weapons, and you keep doing this, you're really headed into a terrible situation. And so I would encourage everybody just to pull back and realize that we're in a serious situation, and it can't be fixed unless people cooperate. We've got to sit down and see what it is that's actually wrong and make a good assessment and try to figure out what to do about it, and everybody will have to work to make it work. You can't just say, well, no, you're going to pay for it all. I'm not going to pay for any of it. Everybody's going to have to work together, or we're not going to come out of this. We're not going to come out of the economy. We're certainly not going to come out of it in foreign policy. We can't order Russia and China around. We can't even order Iran around. It's insane to be giving orders to countries that can blow you off the face of the earth. It's just stupid. And it's stupid to be attacking a president who wanted to normalize relations with Russia in order to minimize the danger of nuclear war, and who wants to bring the jobs back to Americans. I mean, these are things that are worthy of support. Why is he being attacked? So what you see is it's just madness. It's emotion. There's no reason. The cognitive capabilities of the population are declining. Um, how do you get out of a situation like that? That is the real question.
Let me ask you this. I've seen this in the chat and, of course, in the news. They're talking about this great fall, this upcoming recession. As an economist, what do you think about this? I mean, is it just social fodder, or is something like this bound to happen? I mean, we have had some of the largest job growth in history, and the
Not
GDP has
really.
risen too.
Not really. That job growth is largely concocted by how they do the seasonal adjustments. Most of those jobs. Look, you want to know why they have the low unemployment rate? They don't count the unemployed.
Very
If you
good
haven't
point.
if you haven't looked for a job in the last 4 weeks, you're not considered to be part of the workforce, and so your unemployment's not counted.
That's pretty pathetic. A 4 week standard is all they give you? Really?
That's right. And
So let's just say, for instance, a company lays you off for whatever reason, and it takes you, say, several weeks, and it's beyond 4 weeks, and yet you're not counted.
if you're not looking for a job, now what happens? People get discouraged. They lose their job. They start looking for a job. They get discouraged. To me, they get turned down. They make applications. Nothing happens. They don't get an answer. And to look for a job is expensive. You have to, if you go for an interview, you've got to be properly dressed. Your hair has to be cut or done up. You have transportation charges. It's expensive to look for a job. It isn't free. And if you don't have any job, you got no money, and you're using what few resources you have to go for interviews, and nothing ever comes, you get discouraged and you quit.
Oh yeah, you need more than a haircut. You got to wear. You have to get a
Yeah.
new suit. I mean, like you said, it's like a cycle, right? You know, it's
Look,
cost you money to try to make money, and you're not guaranteed to make that money if you're going through these interviews.
it costs you money to be interviewed and to look for a job. And so after time passes, people say, well, I can't afford to look anymore, or I can't face another refusal. They start to feel like there's something wrong with them. And so they just don't search, but they're unemployed, but they're not counted. So that's how they get rid of unemployment. The actual rate of unemployment, if you count all the discouraged workers, the unemployment rate today in the United States is 21%.
Wow, 1 out of 5 people.
And more proof of this, Dr. J, is in the labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate is measured. You can find it online. It is in long-term decline. It's been declining for years, all during a period when allegedly we've had a recovery. Well, if you have a recovery, the labor force participation rate always rises because people enter the workforce to take the jobs. It has never declined during a recovery. But during this alleged recovery since, June of 2009, supposed to be the longest recovery in history and all of that, the labor force participation rate has continually declined.
That was under Obama's administration when a lot of the jobs were solidified to be outsourced.
No, they've been outsourcing them since the 90s.
Wow, since the Clinton
So,
era.
so it really started with the Soviet collapse. So and certainly was in moving along rapidly by 95, 96, 1995, 1996. So they're really, in my opinion, you ask about a recession. We've not come out of the one that happened in '08. We've been in a recession for 10 years, but they cover it up. They cover it up by not counting the unemployment. They cover it up by under measuring inflation. So when you deflate the nominal GDP to take the inflation out, to get the real growth, they have such a low measure of inflation, it doesn't take the inflation out. And so they count inflation as real growth. That's where the real GDP growth number comes from. And they keep the stock market up because the Fed has printed trillions of dollars and all the money has gone into financial assets.
But by printing money, isn't that just encouraging inflation?
It encourages the inflation of the stock and bond prices. And that's where it all went. And in addition, the corporations used all their profits to buy back their own stock because there was nothing to invest in, which is another proof there's been no boom. The corporate in an economic boom and economic recovery, the corporations are investing in their business. This has not happened. 100% of the profits has gone to buying back their own stock. Some of them actually borrowed money to buy back the stock. So they decapitalized the company in order to push up the stock price because that raises their bonuses. So this is why people think there's a recovery. Look, the Fed's balance sheet, and I think when QE started, quantitative easing started, the Fed's balance sheet was about $800 billion. It went up to $4.5 trillion.
Wow.
All that money went into the prices of financial assets and real estate.
Wow.
And so
nothing privatized in that
so
sense.
it looks like, oh, the economy's booming. Anytime the Fed eases up and creates money and credit, the stock market goes up. So that's the story. I don't think there's been a recovery. And is it going to get worse? Well, it may. Now, they want to blame Trump. They'll blame him for tariffs. They'll find the Democrats have to have something to campaign on. So they'll make up all kinds of explanations. The financial media hasn't a clue. They'll just write whatever people are saying. And this is the great danger. We never get to the root situation because there's so much propaganda, so many agendas, so much self-serving information. So that's the situation, Dr. J. I think we've kind of exhausted our time, and the subject also, I think.
Yeah, we have. Let me just read you a couple of comments. First of all, two people are saying that you're spot on what you're saying. Another one, 40% of Americans will die from diabetes and heart disease as they cannot afford meds. 50 million Americans are on food stamps. Anything to say about that?
Well, those are just pretty much the facts.
Let me say one final thing, and then I'll get your final statement, and then just hang by after we end this real quick. This was asked earlier. Again, I still see it as the most recent comment. Big crash coming. Brace yourself for impact. Do you really think that's going to happen?
Well, I think, as I said, we've already had a crash. The crash occurred.
2008, right?
Well, that was the financial crash. The crash occurred long before when so many jobs were moved abroad. When they moved so many high productivity, high value added jobs out of the country, they took them away from Americans. They gave them to the Chinese, the Indonesians, the Indians, the Vietnamese, anywhere in Asia where there was inexpensive labor. So that's when the crash started. The crash started when the American global corporations started moving their production of goods and services out of the United States, put them in other countries, made the products there, and then brought those products back here to sell. The workforce no longer had the income, the jobs. The states and localities, they lost the tax base from the offshore movement of the companies, from the shrinkage of the incomes of the citizens. And so you had all these budgetary problems, which we still have for states and localities. The crash came, it started in the 1990s, 1995, 1996, when you started seeing a big exodus of manufacturing into China, and then of high-skilled software engineering jobs, IT jobs into India. And that's when the crash started. And the financial crash, that was due to the fact they did not regulate derivatives. Derivatives are a very dark instrument. The woman in charge, I think her name was Brooksley Bourne. She was in charge of the Commodities Future Trading Corporation. She tried to do her duty and regulate them. And Alan Greenspan, the Fed chairman, the Secretary of the Treasury, Summers, or he was a deputy secretary, the guy from the SEC, they all went to Congress and said, "You got to stop this woman. She mustn't be allowed to regulate derivatives. The market is self-regulating." And they stopped her, and the crash came. That was a financial crash from the failure to regulate derivatives. But the real crash is the movement offshore of the jobs that's been going on for a quarter of a century. The crash we may have next, it may happen simply because one of the ways they kept consumer spending alive was by the expansion of consumer debt. But everybody now is so indebted, they can't take on any more debt. There's no way they can spend any more money. You know, at some point, you get so indebted, there's no more room on your credit card to add another purchase. And so if we're reaching that point, then yeah, there's going to be a cessation in the growth of consumer spending because they can't take on any more debt. So yeah, there could be more trouble. There could be a lot of trouble if countries, because we are sanctioning everybody, we're putting sanctions here, sanctions there. The way we can do that is because the dollar is the currency of international transactions. If they stop using the dollar, you can't sanction them. So, but what happens if they stop using the dollar? Then all of a sudden, we can't pay our bills by printing money. So then what happens? So yeah, it can get worse. There's no doubt about it. Sooner or later, it will. And as countries say, well, look, these Americans, if you use their currency, if you use their SWIFT system, if you use their clearance system, they can put sanctions on you. So why are we using it? And so you see the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, they all say, no, we're not using the dollar anymore. We're dealing in our own currencies. We're doing business in rubles and yuan and whatever the Iranian currency is. And we're not, and so that means the demand for dollars is going down, but not the supply. So it's going to put, sooner or later, it's going to put pressure on the dollar's value. And then things get worse. So what would the Fed do? Oh my gosh, we have to save the dollar. We have to do what? How can we do it? We have to raise interest rates to make people want to hold dollar assets. So just imagine when they raise interest rates here with all the debt. So yeah, you can have all kinds of scenarios. There's a lot can go wrong. But it's already wrong. It's been wrong for at least 25 years. You know, Reagan fixed the economy, and it would have been okay, except they started offshoring the jobs. That's where the crash came.
We had a surplus under Reagan that we now have a deficit, right?
A surplus what?
Of money in the Federal Reserve as far as our government spending.
Reagan had budget deficits.
He had deficits.
Everybody
Okay.
has budget deficits. The deficits for for the country who is the reserve currency country, deficits, they don't count much because your currency is the world reserve money. So it means all the central banks of all the countries want dollars. They use it as their reserves to protect their currency. Used to people used gold for reserves. But after World War II and the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar became the reserves. So there's plenty of people that want to hold Treasury bonds. And so there's no problem financing the deficits of the reserve currency country. The problem comes if you lose that role. You see, when Britain had the role, they didn't have any trouble. They lost it after World War II. And so the Americans got it. So, and the British had the British had these kinds of debt problems. And their currency declined dramatically. In fact, even one person, just one man, George Soros, was able to raid the British currency and bring it down and make billions of dollars.
Yeah.
So
Billions is an understatement.
if
Yeah.
if you get in a weak situation like that, now that would have been incomprehensible. 10, 20 years before, the British pound was the world reserve money until World War II was over. So these are the things that count. They don't get any discussion. Nobody knows about them. People are just shouting and yelling, or financial press, they only have a few minutes, a few hours maybe. I used to be an editor of the Wall Street Journal. There's not much time to decide on the story and get it in print.
That's right.
You can't sit there and say, now, is this really right? Well, you got to have an explanation because people are going to get the paper and look to see. And if you don't have an explanation, then they're going to read somebody else. So the newspapers haven't got much time. The TV stations, and even less time. So, because I got to go, something happens, I got to give you explanation right then in 5 minutes. I got 5 minutes to give you an explanation, Well, how do they know in 5 minutes? They don't. So the country is full of bogus information simply because there's got to be an explanation ready. If something happens, you got to address it. You can't say, well, we'll come back in a couple of days after we've had time to think about this and talk to people and work it out and try to come up with a good answer. You can't do that. People want to know right now. So you got to tell them something. And that's what the financial press does. Whatever happens, they'll blame it on something that right now, the weather or Trump's tariffs or the Chinese said this or this happened in Korea or so they always have something that they say, oh, this is why it happened because, and it's never right.
I'm glad you brought that up because the left, the candidates for the left, are really pushing on every single one of those topics you just mentioned. I mean, it's sad.
Yeah, none of them have any idea what they're talking about.
I've gotten the impression that they don't really care or pay attention to what people want. They just want to push their party so far left that their interests are only in themselves.
Well, they want power.
Yeah, that's true. Power, yeah, money and power, right? Isn't that what
that's what it is? Yeah,
it comes down to. Yeah. Anyway, it's been a fantastic conversation. This is why I've wanted to talk to you for so long. I'm very honored to have you on this show. If you have any final statements of where people can find you or where they could see your works, read your works, where would you send them to?
Well, I have this website. It's read all over the world. It goes into all kinds of foreign translations. And it's easy to find. It's just my name, paulcraigroberts.org. .org, not .com, .org. And they can, and I'm there, and I have guests there who have intelligent and sensible things to say. And we don't have an agenda except to try to tell the truth as best as we can find it. We don't have a Republican agenda. We don't have a Democratic agenda. We don't have a right-wing agenda, a left-wing, a white, a black, or Latino, or we no agenda except the truth as best as we can discover it.
We are honestly blessed to have someone like you on this planet who's doing that kind of work, who doesn't care about which side, but's telling the truth. Everybody, you heard the great words of the Honorable Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J, and I am officially signing off.
And you're listening to Dr. J, Radio Alive.
Say it one more time, and then that's perfect, and we're good to go.
I'm Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary of the United States Treasury, and you're listening to Dr. J, Radio Live.